Hi, my name is Tom Dougherty, and I teach philosophy at the University of Cambridge. Today I want to talk to you about consent. Some philosophers think that we have to understand morality in terms of the relationships between one individual and another. For example, if you're minding your own business and a stranger cuts off some of your hair, then she wrongs you by violating your rights, and you have a grievance against her. That grievance arises in the context of your relationship to her. You relate to her as someone you have a right against. Rights over our hair are among the rights we have over our bodies. We also have rights over our property. Often, if someone infringes another person's rights, then they harm that person by making them worse off. For example, if your housemate borrows your car without your consent, then she can make you worse off because now you can't use the car. But rights and harm are distinct parts of morality, and someone can infringe another person's right without harming them. If a camper puts up her tent on the farmer's fields, then the camper might not cause any damage, but should still be trespassing and disrespecting the farmer's property rights. Because of our rights over our bodies and property, we each have personal zones that other people aren't allowed to interfere with. So if others respect our rights, then we can enjoy freedom, security, and privacy. But our lives would be worse if we could never interact with each other's bodies and property. If no one was ever allowed to cut your hair, then it would just grow and grow, or you'd have to cut it yourself. Fortunately, you can allow another person to cut your hair by giving your consent. This would mean you'd waive your right against her cutting your hair. You'd change the moral aspects of your relationship with her. This makes consent a way that we control the moral boundaries around our bodies and our property. When our rights are involved, we get to decide how people are allowed to interact with us. If we decide not to consent at all, or if we withdraw our consent, then they're not allowed to make contact with us. But by giving consent, we can permit them to do things that they would otherwise not be allowed to do. Often we consent to someone's action because we also want them to perform this action. But that's not always the case. Suppose you don't want your frenemy coming to your party. You know that if you invite him, then he'll stay away from the party in order to spite you. So you invite him. Now your frenemy has your consent to attend the party, even though you don't want him to attend. Or maybe you'd like your favourite co-worker to eat some of your cookies. But you think that if you consent to your favourite co-worker, then out of fairness you'd have to consent to all your other co-workers eating your cookies too. And you don't want to share your cookies with so many people. So you decide not to let any of your co-workers eat your cookies. Even though you want your favourite co-worker to eat your cookie, you haven't consented to him eating it. So our desires and consent don't always coincide. You can want someone to eat a cookie without consenting to that person eating a cookie. And you can consent to someone coming to your party without wanting that person to come to your party. That means that consenting to someone's action is not the same thing as wanting them to perform the action. In other words, consent is not the same thing as desire. Instead, consent is what philosophers call a normative power. A normative power is the ability to control our moral relationships with other people. Consent is our normative power to waive our rights and make it okay for people to interact with us in certain ways. Having this ability is one type of autonomy. Autonomy means self-rule. We are autonomous when we control how our lives go. By giving consent, we are autonomous by controlling our moral relationships with other people. For consent to succeed in waiving a right, it needs to be a meaningful expression of autonomy. Philosophers often put this point by saying that consent needs to be valid. Consent can be invalid in at least 3 ways. First, someone's consent would be invalid if they lacked key decision-making abilities that are necessary for giving valid consent. A small child can't validly consent to a permanent tattoo because she's too young to give meaningful consent. Similarly, if an adult is highly intoxicated, then he would also not validly consent to the tattoo. Some philosophers put this point by saying that someone needs to be competent to give consent. Second, someone's consent would be invalid if they were uninformed. Suppose your neighbour asks to store a box in your garage, saying that the box is full of old books. Actually, the box contains stolen jewels, and there's no way you would have agreed if you'd known the truth. Because you weren't properly informed about the box's contents, you didn't validly consent to store the box on your property. Third, someone's consent would also be invalid if they didn't freely consent. Suppose a mafioso threatens to burn down a restaurant unless she's allowed to dine past closing time. Because the restaurant owner is being coerced into agreeing, his consent isn't valid, and so it's wrong for the mafioso to stay in the restaurant past closing time. So someone's consent is valid only when it's suitably competent, informed, and free. These are the three main conditions that ensure that when someone consents, she meaningfully controls how other people are permitted to interact with her. Interestingly, each of these conditions comes in degrees. People can be more or less competent, informed, and free. If the extent to which someone is competent, informed, or free makes a difference to how meaningful their consent is, then we might not just want to think in terms of a binary between consensual and non-consensual interactions. We might also think of interactions as being more or less consensual. Thanks for watching. To subscribe to Wireless Philosophy on YouTube, click here.